Is the city of Austin's zoning totally fucked? Well, we know it is, but why is that? We have a very special guest on today's broadcast, and that's my good friend, Austin Stowell. Austin is one of the experts in real estate when it comes to zoning, and he's got an amazing story about how fucked up the city can be towards the end of this broadcast. We're gonna be doing a lot of videos on zoning, the history of zoning, and putting it together with some of the interviews I've had with Chris Affinito, Austin Stowell, and some others to kind of give you the layout of the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to zoning in Austin. So this is segment one of that. This is my podcast with Austin Stowell. Subscribe to the channel to get more on the city of Austin zoning problems and what we can do to cure them. And see you at the end of the show for the link to the next video with Chris Affinito. Okay, so here with Austin Stowell, a good friend of mine, known him for many years, and we were just talking, I don't really remember when we met. It was a long time ago. We were both a lot younger, I know that. How long have you been in real estate?
I got licensed in 2002.
Okay.
When I was still in college, yeah.
Okay, I got licensed in 2004. And we're going to talk about a few things here. We're going to talk about zoning changes, the experience you had in the city. But before we get into that, let's talk about when you first got your license. Were you a leasing agent or?
Yeah, I had a roommate in college that I was actually went to pharmacy school. So when I was an undergrad, I was working as a pharmacy technician, and I think I was making like $12 or $13 an hour. A buddy of mine was a server at Papado, but also was a leasing agent, and he would go around to all the fraternity and sorority meetings and like give kind of a leasing pitch a few times a year.
Oh, cool.
And he ended up, making more than his, annual salary or annual tips at his restaurant. Wow. Just in a few rounds. And I was seeing how much money he was making from leasing and started doing a little bit of that in college. But that was the main reason I got licensed.
And you were a pharmacist for a while, right?
Yep. Just up the road, Target Store 96.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
And then when you decided to go back to real estate, what company did you go with?
So I was at when I first got licensed, I started off with Austin Silent Property Group, or George McGee's old man was my first broker, and then I went with Dave Van Heuven Properties, and I was there for quite some time.
Oh, way.
And that was kind of the majority of my early career doing downtown work.
Yeah, and Todd Bailey too.
Todd wasn't at Van. Where was?
No, he wasn't in Van, but he said that he did some downtown. I had happy hour. He's coming on here pretty soon. So okay, and then you got your broker's license. What year?
I'm trying to think when I got licensed as a broker, probably like 2007, 2008, something like that.
Okay. And then you started your own company?
Started my own company, Keep Real Estate, and then operated as a solo broker for quite some time. I had a small development that I had done over on the east side on East 12th Street, and started that process. And part of my kind of skin in the game was the brokerage side of things. And so took that opportunity to jump and kind of start my own company, learn a little bit more about development, and also kind of move on towards starting my own brokerage as well.
Okay. And then you eventually started developing properties yourself.
Yeah. So that was kind of the first foray. So the genesis of both the development, kind of my experience inside real estate was, or the real estate development world was through starting my own brokerage in order to kind of facilitate that initial development that we did over on the east side.
Okay. Gotcha. And so how many did you have, like a team with you, or?
So it was just me. Yeah. It was just me. So that's what we, as a solo agent, but then also wanting to kind of leverage my position as the broker on the deal, but also raise the money, learn how to navigate the process in terms of hiring architects, hiring builders, hiring engineers, et cetera, to kind of like work through that development process.
Gotcha. When did you first start to realize how bad it was to develop properties in Austin?
Yeah, I mean, I think anybody that's built, I think our land development code is one of the more complex in the country. Yeah, I think I don't really know any different, so it's inevitably complex. But I've never experienced anything. We're about to do like a project in Lockhart and a project in Marble Falls, and I can tell you it's considerably easier. You walk into the office and you speak directly to someone as opposed to going through, the online portal that the city of Austin has kind of put everyone through since COVID.
Yeah, and with those complexities, there's also opportunities.
Yeah, I think that there's riches in the niches, and I think that that's one of the situations that gives people an advantage that have been here for a long time because they know how to navigate it and know the resources and the people to hire to kind of make it through that process.
Yeah. So tell me about the history, as you know it, of development, right? I mean, I think the last, or not development, zoning changes. And so the last time we had a zoning change was like 1975?
I think it was in the mid-'80s. Our current LDC is from the mid-'80s. So it's almost as old as I am.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And so what has been, in your words, the problem with it? Is it, NIMBYs versus YIMBYs, that type of thing?
I think it's a situation where it's, death by a thousand cuts, or in this case, it's like continued added complexity seems to be the constant Band-Aid that we go down the road with. Even if you look at the initial drafts of what CodeNEXT wanted to be, it's frustrating in the city of Austin. We have a government that, even like the mayor itself, and this is a constant frustration that I think of people locally in politics, and I think mayors have said it both publicly and privately, is that the mayor in Austin is a relatively weak position. We have to get consensus from all the council members, and if you think about from when the initial land development code was passed, we've gone from a citywide electorate in which everyone voted for all the council members, and it was rotating, and then we went to the 10-1 system that we currently have, where everyone votes for the mayor, but that we have our each unique council district. That added further complexity to it because it changed the face of how we elect our politicians locally. And we essentially have to get everyone to agree, which made it even harder. It used to be, there's something to be said in terms about having representation in terms of this 10-1. I think the intent is strong, but the problem is that, when you're governing and trying to write code for a city, you can't just be reflective on your individual district.
Okay, explain 10-1 to me.
So we have 10 individual council members, 10 individual council districts, and then the mayor, right? Yep. So the mayor is voted on by the entire city. In this case, we just elected Mayor Watson over Celia Israel.
Yep.
And then you have your individual council districts, and you can look up and see the map, and that was just the mapping process itself was very political in Austin and where we map everybody.
Yeah.
But again, like the problem is that we have this electorate that is responsive only to a small minority of Austin, and so Allison Alter's constituents are going to be very different than someone in a different district, right?
Yeah.
So that's going to be and everyone's responsive to those things. For example, Allison's district, which is like up northwest Austin, is their primary concern in a lot of arguments you'll see is this transition of trying to make it easier to develop larger lots or put more units on a lot. There's a lot of resistance from her constituents against that.
Yeah.
Whereas other areas, that's really would be helpful in order to bring affordable housing into the central core.
Yeah.
And so it's this balance of trying to maintain the integrity of these each distinct districts, and then there's sub-districts within those. It's also particularly challenging because the city of Austin, we're in a situation in which I think on average like less than 10% of people vote. And it depends on whether or not it's a presidential year. They've tried to change the electoral calendars. Like our current mayoral vote, I think is going to be, it was just changed so that it will coincide with a presidential election. And so the idea is we'll have more people vote.
Right.
And hopefully we have more people coming out. But if you look at these minor elections, it's pretty wild to see how few people vote, particularly when it goes, and so many of these votes too, you have quite a few people that come in and run.
Yeah.
And then if you end up with like no one with a clear majority, you end up in a runoff. And then if you had, let's say 10% of people vote, like less than 5% of people will vote. And so if you think about, these constituencies that they're responding to, it's a relatively small group of people when we're trying to deal with a, multi-million person.
Yeah. And so the way that the zoning is working now for the central core, which is and kind of the issue here for people that don't know is that you're not allowed to build enough units on one lot, and they call that density, right? You want more density, and especially on a residential lot, you can only build a duplex if the lot is 5,600 square feet.
5750.
57, yeah. And if it's a house, like I remember I was and almost had a listing in a house in Barton Hills that had 0.75 acres, and you can just build, had a house and then a 1,000 square foot guest house, right? Which does not, and what happens is that as the prices go up and that's all you can build, the people that service these communities, the people that work at the gas stations, that wait tables, they're pushed further out, kind of your blue collar workers. And that lends to being more of an expensive part of the equation, and in some cases has run certain restaurants out because they can't pay enough to service to hire the people that service their customers.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. So they've done a few things, like where if you're what is it a certain 2 blocks from a major corridor, you can build a little bit more, right?
That was the original intent. I mean, so that people have always NIMBY culture to begin with, right? Is like they
NIMBY,
don't
not
in my backyard. You want
Yeah.
everything to be closer.
Yeah.
So I think the general concession that is easy for a lot of people is to say, well, let's develop along major corridors. In these, we've been talking about CodeNEXT and if you think about the Imagine Austin plan, I think Imagine Austin is 20 plus years old, and then you have a code that's 40 years old, and then you have CodeNEXT has been being discussed. I think we just hit 10 years from the site that we developed on 12th Street. The only reason we were able to even develop that site is that site was exempt from our current zoning plan. Mm-hmm. It was what they call an NCCD, or Neighborhood Community Combining District. And the idea is that it essentially throws out all, and this was part of there's several NCCDs in Austin. Hyde Park is one of them.
Yeah.
You had 11th Street, 12th Street, and then there's I think there's a few more, one over on West 6th. But the idea is that exempts all of the rest of the code and allows the rules to be slightly different. And we even had city staff when we developed these 15 single-family houses on 12th Street. And a lot of people call them townhomes, but they were indeed single-family. And that's the distinction, because when you talk about development now, oftentimes what has to be done is we can only build condos. Because the idea is that our land development code is not incentivized in any capacity to try and break land up into individual ownership, which is what most, as a realtor yourself, most people prefer. You don't necessarily mind being in an HOA, but the idea is you prefer to own your land, right?
Yeah.
It's the Texas way. And I think that there's a huge market for that, but our land development code does not allow that. And so you'll see a lot of these small subdivisions, and the idea is it's let's say you take an acre lot and you get 12 units and you all collectively own the land around it, but you don't necessarily own your own plot. The city had taken these lands via eminent domain back in, I believe, the 80s, and were originally going to build affordable housing. They had a contract with Fannie Mae in order to build affordable housing, but that contract reached a point in which they were supposed to, I think they had 20 years to actually complete their project.
Yeah.
They never actually did. And so, in typical government wisdom, they intended to do something and never actually did it.
Yep.
Well, someone called the note. The feds called the note and said, you never built affordable housing, so now you have to sell it.
Yeah.
So we came in through a public bid process and raised money and put forth a bid along with some other people and to develop these. But what was unique about them is that you had 10 individual lots and then 5 on the second parcel. And that allowed us to build 15 single family houses on lots that were between 2,500 and 3,500 square feet. Yeah. Which is really cool and unique.
Yeah.
And so I think, we even had city planners coming in looking at our site and be like, this would be great as an idea on what to put into CodeNEXT.
Yeah.
So that circles back as to what the city's goals were inside CodeNEXT. And part of it was to make unique development standards that could be spread throughout the city. Because currently most single family lots are zoned what they call SF3, which is the minimum 5,750. So they had talked about changing minimum lot size, allowing the number of units that could be built on an individual lot, and changing that. Currently it's maxed out at 2.
Yeah.
Changing something as simple as changing it to 4.
Yep.
Well, you talk about a decade worth of back and forth on CodeNEXT. Each incremental change watered down the intent.
Yeah.
And then it's better to have, the devil you know is better than the devil you don't.
Yeah.
And at least our existing code, although it's terrible, people generally know the rules, both city staff and developers, and those two parties have to work together to create housing and to change the dynamic of our supply side issue.
Yeah.
The problem is that, like, when you go into passing CodeNEXT, we again governed by this mass consensus where no one can agree, and we're constantly making concessions, and no one can actually make an executive decision to like say what is correct. And so we went into this giant circular motion to where it just continually got watered down, watered down, watered down.
Yeah.
So now we have like hypothetical mapping with larger zoning on corridors. Nothing's been done.
Nothing's been done.
And we're back to square one.
And so when you say nothing's been done, my understanding is that, first of all, what is the votes needed? It's not like a majority win with city council, right? It's what would happen with that?
I mean, ultimately, I think for a zoning change, they tried to go through, and there was a lawsuit between several prominent attorneys in Austin that were suing the mayor and council. They were trying to pass it on a simple majority.
Yeah.
So we also have a process through state law that is what they call the valid petition process. And if you are within let's say, I take the lot where your office is and I want to build a high-rise apartment on it, I have to give notice to people within a certain distance that there's going to be this change in zoning. The people can come in. There's a process by which they can appeal and create what they call a valid petition. I think if it's over 70% of adjacent landowners, then they can all sign off, and then that would change the metric within the city charter and a supermajority. So in this case, you'd have to have 8 of 11 to like vote, right?
In order to change it. Well, because what you're saying is 70% of the people that showed up, all right, did not want it to happen.
Well, yes and no. So what had happened is that what I'm referencing about, let's say your office in that hypothetical, is that it's purely for an individual piece of land, right?
Yeah.
The city, by its nature, was trying to say, well, we're not rezoning, so we don't need, because we're just adopting a new code.
Yeah.
The people that were fighting against the city made the argument, and successfully in court said that you are indeed changing the zoning, right? And so by that, they have the rights of a valid petition, and so they got a judge to agree with them, and to avoid a massive lawsuit, and go and actually have that challenged again in an appellate court. They, I think, saw the writing on the walls through city legal and says, we need to actually do this as if everyone in the city of Austin has a right via valid petition. And so the idea is, and that would require any vote that changes the zoning code and to push it into where it would require a supermajority, which is 8 of 11 votes. And we have, the band of 4 on council that were clearly willing to vote no against that.
Got you. And are they just like trying to, do what their constituents want, or?
I think yes, but keep in mind is that what the city needs, and what I think if you took a popular vote in Austin,
right, versus
let's say the few thousand people, I think 10,000 people or whatever that may have voted in Allison Alters district.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
So like that's where we're being governed.
Yeah.
In the city of Austin is these. Now the constituency of council has changed. Kathy Tovo is no longer District 9.
Yeah.
We now have a new council member who's very much pro-housing.
Yeah.
And so I think the tides are changing in some capacity. And now that we have Kirk Watson as the mayor, he's, he is a really effective politician.
Yeah.
And if you look at what, the history of his ability to kind of like gain consensus, he was a longstanding operative Democrat in the Texas state ledge, and was very effective in getting things passed. And I think that I don't think you can be a Democrat in the Texas state legislature without the ability to persuade.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think part of the problem is that getting this out to the vote and on the changes, it's just such a massive undertaking that only happens, every few years, right?
Well, I think at any point someone could bring up a vote for CodeNEXT. I think no one wants to call a vote and until we all agree, right? Because it still got kind of cut off at the knees. It was all of the details for CodeNEXT were in the process of being refined. When this new rule or the new interpretation that we'd have to get a supermajority to do it. And so I think that process has been ongoing, but again, there's still tons of fighting in terms of the mapping and all the details. And then there's also just the inherent risk of the complexity that would come with an entirely new code. Mm-hmm. I think those of us that have watched the process happen, I think are,
burned out.
Well, not just burned out. I think equally afraid of what the new code could be, because if the intent is to try and remove complexity, and then you understand the rules of a very complex game, and then someone shakes it up and starts a new one, it's if the goal is to add supply, I think that there's a real risk that could cause problems too, because staff has to learn all this stuff too.
Yeah, but so I guess the general thought now is, look, the city's progressing, not as fast as we want. Right. Politicians constituents are progressing. The politicians are progressing. So we're just kind of waiting on a more progressive majority. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, I think in some level, I think yes, there is a clear wait and see game that's present in local politics as to what will need to happen in order to maintain and move the needle towards a more pro-housing stance across the majority of council, including a supermajority if it does come to a vote like that. Do I think CodeNEXT is going to pass in any capacity? Probably not, is my gut. But that doesn't mean that all is lost. I think that the city council could take real action now to try and change their position and simplify the code that we have. And I think that internally, at least what I've seen from a lot of developers, a lot of people in the land use world, is how do we kind of bridge that gap? And is it completely with a new code, or is it a situation where while we're waiting for a new code to continue to be argued about, could we do something real action now to change the supply side of housing? Remove some of that complexity. And I think like some of those things are like removing subchapter F, which is like the McMansion ordinance that was passed in the 90s in response to a lot of people in Terrytown that were complaining about their neighbors, because that was one of the areas where people could afford to go in and completely build new as opposed to remodel. And we ended up with really large houses in the old historic neighborhood that admittedly a lot of the designs were terrible, but you can't legislate good design. I think anytime you try and do that, you end up with some of the ridiculous rules that we have. Like, and if you talk to any developer, like they can go to town talking about subchapter F. Between the gables and what is a gable, what's an articulating wall. Like we have all these. You'll see. If you go to any new construction house that happens to be on a large lot, and you'll see these jut outs on the sides of the house, and you're like, what's that for? And that's all related to subchapter F.
Well, right. I mean, like not every house is going to be gorgeous. Right. There's going to be some mistakes made, and but I think you're still in a capitalist, supply and demand.
Free markets will fix a lot of things.
That's right, because if you build one ugly house, you're probably not going to build two.
Right. And I think they won't resell. And I think that I've seen a lot of developers in Central Austin really up their game on the design side. And I think that you can spend more money on design when you're not spending 10% of your budget on consultants. Right. If you think about that.
Absolutely. And that's what we do, because we have to navigate all these tricky things. Now, but now there have been some amendments to larger buildings, condos, stuff like that, right? I know Chris Stefanini was telling me one, and I can't remember in the last podcast I did with him, but you can do some stuff with a lot more if you're putting some affordable housing in it.
If you're doing affordable housing, that the density bonus side of things is certainly a real thing. I personally think that the density bonus side of things is a little bit the Wild West, because I've seen some really squirrely deals happen, right? Where it's like it's affordable housing, and when you and I talk about affordable housing, it's like you're like, oh, a teacher can live there, and that's what's pitched to council. But what ends up happening is like people manipulate their income. Let's say you're rich and you've got a college student that just graduated, has like an entry level job somewhere. All of a sudden they qualify for affordable housing, but they're rich. It's like there's plenty of examples in which that intent can be manipulated, and also when you talk about how affordable housing is qualified, it's usually based on median family income, and the MFI of Austin has gotten up really high, and so generally most of these rules early on, when it was 80% of MFI, the previous, let's say like 10 years ago when we developed 12th Street, I had teachers that made too much money, even though they only made $45,000 a year, to be able to get affordable housing, and they could barely afford rent. And it was like, so the numbers were too low, and now as Austin becomes MFI is, I haven't seen the recent stats, but like a family four, it's probably over $100,000. So it's like, to me, that's not what I think of when you think of affordable housing. And so most of the metrics at 80%, which in the reality is like when we need affordable housing, we need people that are at 40% MFI.
Yeah.
And so it's like, it's a weird situation to navigate.
Yeah, well, it seems like there's a lot of complexity and not a whole lot of solutions, you know. And again, wait and see.
Well, I think it's, like trying to lose weight, right? The way I think of it is like, you don't have to go on a massive lifestyle change day one, right?
Yeah.
Like you don't have to immediately run a marathon, stop drinking alcohol, like fix everything, eat perfect, like nothing but veggies and fruit, whatever. Like,
right.
The idea is like, you don't have to do everything on day one. You just want to make incremental progress on anything. Like if you're just like 1% better a day, right? And I think that that's the position that council should take. Is like, what is something we can do this week? And I've said, 1,000 times, I think one of the number one things that the city council could do is, start tweaking parking requirements. Like if you think about like how things are developed, we have limited spots particularly in the central core of Austin. And it's like we're reserving spots on land for cars that the idea as if like to every single unit needs 2 parking spaces. On like, and when you talk about parking spaces, it's not just parking spaces. Like depending on the shape of the lot, I get the idea is that people don't want to have it set up to where there's just cars all over the road.
Sure.
But the reality is like, my house technically has 1 parking space, right? There's I guess technically 2 because it's required by code. But the idea is like you can still fit several cars there, right? And if we developed changed our landscape around, you could park 4 cars. The idea is like, the city, how people effectively park is going to be different than like what is required. But ultimately what we are doing is reserving like spots for development land on areas that are walkable to bus stops and bikeable.
Well, and it's like, it's funny because you got, on one hand, you got like this density issue, like they don't want much more than 45% of their, of the footprint. But then we also require all these parking spots. I mean, those things aren't congruent.
Look at some of these new downtown buildings. I mean, like you have, there's also an economic impact in the sense that lenders do want to have a sufficient parking ratio, which makes sense. But like, there's plenty of buildings. Like if you go to different areas, like let's say San Diego, I have a friend that developed a property in Little Italy, 0 parking. It's like, it's 40 stories tall. It's a bunch of efficiency units. It's very walkable, and there's no parking that was required. I mean, I think they put a few units in there. But the idea is like, that is a unique set of circumstances. It's not even possible in Austin. If you look at some of these new buildings downtown, it's like you'll look and it's just a tower of parking.
Like I think the Modern has like, I don't know, 8 stories or something like that of parking.
Exactly. And you could require a lot of it to be subterranean, but again, that changes the cost structure and the economics of the building and how to deliver it. But I think that for a progressive city that focuses on bike lanes and sidewalks and all these other things, our land development code is not in line with what the goal should be, which is housing.
Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit about, you've had a very popular name in the paper for several years. Talk me through that. How did that start?
You're talking about Metropolis?
Yeah.
So, I bought a property. We had sold our first spec deal. This is back when I was still a pharmacist. We had done a new build in 2004. Karen Kelly and I had done it. And when we sold that, we split the proceeds, and I went out and there's a property that is a boarded up old Church of Christ that looks like an old barn. On Metropolis at 500 Metropolis Drive.
There's one right here too, by the way.
Is there? So
it's overgrown and like falling down. It's got a historical plaque on it.
Oh, does it?
Yeah.
Which one is it?
I don't know.
Do you know what the building is?
It's just like an old black church.
Is it? Okay. I'm trying to think. It's probably the one on Kenny.
No, it's Goodrich.
It's on Goodrich? Okay. I'll need to drive by and look and see if it's... Because there's several of the rural Negro schools from back pre-segregation that are... when we went through this, we learned a lot of the history through Travis County. They did a historical study, and I think there were 19.
Okay.
Maybe even more than that. It's been a while since I looked at that document.
Yeah.
But we bought this. I want to say it was it was probably 2016 when we bought it, maybe. I think it was $250,000, something like that. And we bought it. It was a weird situation because it was on about an acre, but it had this huge section of right of way. And originally, at one point, the city of Austin took that right of way. I think maybe TxDOT did, but they were one of the government municipalities was going to take a road through there to connect Grove. And what ended up happening is that they ended up never actually building the road. There's some environmental concerns over at the Riverside Golf Course, which used to be the old ACC. And so they couldn't get the environmental regulations through to be able to connect that road. So originally, like, you were going to have Metropolis, Riverside, and Grove was going to be a connection that zigzagged across to get out to the airport. Politics changed. The city grew super fast, and eventually that road was abandoned. And we went through and worked at length with the transportation department to try and get them to agree to release that land. They agreed to release it. And then, so we had 2 parcels that were originally a square that we were going to reconnect and make it a whole square again. Eventually do something with the building or not. We hadn't really even thought much about it. We had thought about the potential to demolish it and went ahead and applied for a demo permit.
You got it.
By default. We had looked at a couple different options. With new zoning, the thought was we wanted to have kind of a mixed use zoning. And so that kind of evolved into several different plans, but when we went to apply for a demo permit, we came across this issue that it was a historic Negro school. And so back the original church that was there, they had developed the school adjacent to it to educate the community because AISD, or at that time Travis County, was in charge of education and had excluded African American students from public schools. And so the community itself had built their own school, and they had actually transported this from Camp Swift, this building. They had gotten it and then transported it and put it on this site and turned it into a schoolhouse. And then after Brown versus Board, the school was desegregated, and so the school essentially closed shop because at that point the schools were integrated. And so shortly after that, in the process, the church itself was the county filed eminent domain to take the church and then demolish the church to eventually build the road that never was.
So they already have plans to demolish this anyway.
So ultimately, they didn't demolish it because it wasn't in the way.
Right.
But the church itself was.
But it was okay for them.
Right. Correct. They demolished the historic black church. And they left the school building there. In the 80s, it was acquired by Metropolis Church of Christ, or it may have been actually even before that. I think it may have been the 70s. So they took over that church. They operated as a church, and then the church, I think, essentially lost population, and then they closed the doors. And so that building had been vacant. I'm 41 years old. It had been vacant my entire life. And has been boarded up since the early 80s.
Same as this one over here.
And it had it's ironically in really good condition because the owner and the deacon of the church owns Metropolis Supply, which is sheet metal shop. And so they had sheathed the entire building in sheet metal, which had actually done a really good job of preserving the building. During this process, we had never even actually been in other than the first time when we bought it. And so when we started having discussions about the history and like trying to find a way to preserve it, like we went through and like looked at it, and we were willing to preserve it through the zoning process. And then
so your idea was to preserve it.
So we repositioned the entire development plan. Originally, we were just going to cut a road through there and build single family houses on all sides. We were going to connect Kemp to Metropolis and then build houses on both sides of that road. That was plan A. The idea is we really didn't have a specific plan. And if we could get mixed use zoning, we could turn the old school and do a historic building. We were willing to maybe partner with the city and some sort of like they could do some sort of like collaboration, whether it's a purchase or figure it out if there's a way to do a lease to operate. There's some sort of public private partnership to where that could operate, and then we could still have the effective goal, which is density on the corridor, and put like some sort of retail establishment there, and then put single family houses. This was just like plan B. We were open to several different options, and we spent tons of money trying to come up with plans on what to do. And then we had by default we ended up, because the city had spent so much time in the process through the historic demolition permit process, they essentially timed out. They spent so many times delaying the case, and under the city charter, they're required to give you the demo permit after that 180 days.
Yeah. Okay.
And so at that point, that's how we were we got it kind of like by a mistake, honestly, on the city's part.
Yeah. And I remember, didn't you have like the act somehow, how did it become such a big deal with the community?
Well, I mean, I think it's because the historic nature of the church, and I think if you think about the history of it and the politics of it, in the sense that the city originally took a eminent domain, took a historic black, community facility, tore it down, and then through that process, kind of broke the history of the community, right? And then this was a remnant that was left over, and albeit forgotten, up until something was going to change. And I understand the kind of the.
I do too. But it just seems to me that people were up in arms about it, and you, from what I remember, talking to you and reading the headlines, and especially talking with you, you're like, we're not saying we're going to do anything like we're negotiable to do anything that someone could cooperate with us, right?
Well, the problem is that the zoning itself, and this happens across town, is that a lot of times, particularly churches, because churches can exist in a single family neighborhood. So when they rezoned a lot of properties, they rezoned churches and changed the future land use map, because you have zoning in Austin, then you have the future land use maps. And the future land use maps are what dictate the plan on zoning, and so that communicates to the the commissions that advise and consent towards council. And the idea is you have zoning and planning, which is ZAP. You have planning commission, which is PC, and those give advice, and they use those future land use maps. And a lot of single family churches, if you look, most churches in town, if they're in a neighborhood, will get changed on a flume to single family, because the idea is if you ever change it, you have to change the flume, and then that has to go to planning commission, and then it has to go to council. And so it's this kind of ties back to the complexity of our code, in the sense that you have a place that's been vacant for 40 years that is currently not operating as anything, trying to change something. And so at this point, we had a demo permit, and we tried to work with the city to find an alternative to demolition. And got them. And there's also huge expenses that goes into this, right? So just in permitting fees, you'll spend $10,000, $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 just to get through the process. Just for someone to tell you yes or no. So our position was that we have an active demo permit. And the idea is I would like partnership with the city to help us facilitate. And so we asked the city staff if they'd be willing to be the applicant on our behalf to change the zoning. And so that would send us through the future land use map process. And then through planning commission. And so they were willing to do that. And so we went through that process, and including spending money to talk about the inevitable thoughts of what we could turn the facility into. And then everything really went off the rails when a couple community advocates wanted the city to purchase it. Now, at this time, the city didn't have any money to buy it. One thing changed, though, during this process is that Kathy Tova, in a rare partnership with Ellen Troxler, fellow realtor, who is so she had come up with the ideas to reallocate hotel tax. And so we have one of the highest hotel taxes in the state. City of Austin charges 11% on every night that you stay in a hotel, and it goes back. And so what it did is they changed a certain percentage of that hotel tax that can go towards it was essentially getting filtered towards the convention center fund, right? Now that is essentially a slush fund that lots of people have their hands in. And what the Kathy Tova and Ellen wanted was a separate fund in which the city council would have more purview over. And so they changed, and so a percentage of every hotel tax they now got allocated and changed what it could be used for. It couldn't just only be used on the convention center. It could be used on other things that could advance potential travel and community benefit to Austin, including historic structures. And so simultaneously, as we're having these inline negotiations, and the city had discussed purchasing it, but like said, we don't have the funds. And then all of a sudden the rules changed, and then they could turn around and they had a new fund that they could draw from to pay for it. Now the problem is that we're all in real estate. I'm down to sell something, if it's a fair price. The problem is that when the government tries to buy something from you, they get to determine what's fair.
Sure.
I was under the misconception that we lived in Texas and that property rights prevail, and I've learned an amazing amount about eminent domain. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
What I have learned is that any government entity can take whatever you want.
Yeah.
Whatever they want, and they can pay whatever they think is fair.
Yep.
And the city of Austin spends a lot of money with individual appraisers that they always hire the same ones to give whatever value that they want.
So essentially, they were trying to purchase your land from you.
Yeah, we were trying to go through the process to rezone it, and then all of a sudden they're like, oh, well, now we do have money.
Yeah.
And then so they said, actually, we're not going to give you the zoning, and so you can't do anything with it.
We're going to take it from you.
And we're going to take it from you, and because you don't have your zoning, it's not worth much.
Yeah.
So like they controlled both ends of it.
Sure.
Which is the challenge that I had with it, is that the price being paid was not fair.
Yeah.
And so then that pushes you into the next multi-year process.
But what you decided to sue them?
Well, so technically they're suing me.
Okay.
Right. So, but during eminent domain court trials, like I think that whoever the plaintiff is depends on which venue you're in.
Yeah.
And I think I eventually became the plaintiff.
Gotcha.
And so we countersued. And so we ended up at trial. And because of the politics of the case, I know that the city is, from what I understand, I think the city spent several $100,000 on the case. We spent several $100,000 on the case.
Yeah.
An enormous waste of resources.
Yeah.
We had an appraisal that showed it was worth over $1 million.
Yeah.
Tried to explain that to them.
Yeah.
They declined and continued to, lower the value because they kept going back to what we paid, and that becomes relevant in some level, but that was the only thing they would focus on is what we paid.
Well, that is also the opportunity cost, the development cost, the continual denial,
or the fact that Austin had been going up at 25% annually, if not 35% in certain areas,
right,
year over year, from the time we paid it, from the time we originally purchased it. And so we ended up going to trial. Actually, had to go all the way through a jury trial.
Wow.
And then I think it was May.
Just last May. Yeah. Wow.
So we purchased it, I think 2015, but we went to a jury trial and then won a jury trial.
Wow. And did you get your court case, your expenses that was paid too?
So no, that's another thing. Your expenses aren't paid.
No way.
Yeah. So this is it's most eminent domain trial attorneys work on contingency.
Mm-hmm.
And you can certainly pay hourly, but it can get really expensive.
Yeah.
And the idea is that contingency is usually, depending on the amount of money at play, is usually the better play for the landowner.
But they did have to so what exactly did you win? I don't know if it's.
So I think I paid $250 for the property. I think their original offer to me, they originally wanted to take both parcels that I owned, despite the fact they had no legal use for one.
Yeah. Through
the process, we got them to agree that they had no right to take the other one because it didn't have the structure on it.
Yeah.
So the one property that they said I think they said the whole site was worth originally like $300,000 or something like that. Yeah. We sold the one parcel, individually for almost that entire amount. Yeah. Right. To a separate developer. Mm-hmm. What the 37,000 foot tract that was left over, we went to trial over value. I think their initial, price was $200,000 for it. And I think the final jury award was like $1,068,000. Okay. So obviously quite a big difference in terms of the
which I mean, after everything you went through, it's probably a wash, right?
Well, we certainly ended up in the black on it, I think, but it's we spent an enormous sum of money.
So that's the amount of money you won, but you also had the property.
So the city owns it now.
Okay. Yeah. That's so I guess what the trial's over is over how much they're willing to spend. You're arguing in court it is worth this much, and you got a jury to agree to that. Correct. Yeah. Okay. And what have they done with that?
It's important to note that like when it comes to eminent domain, like the way it works is that you have the right to appeal the right to take, which you can spend several $100,000. And if you look, the Supreme Court has not even been kind to landowners on most cases. Yeah. The government can really stretch their ability for public good. Yeah. Pretty broadly. Yeah. It's a really uphill battle. Yeah. One that I was pretty much told, there's zero chance you're going to win unless you have someone like Institute for Justice or IJ run your case. Yeah. Because they've got nonprofit money that actually runs through to try and create case law. Yeah. And unless your case is interesting to them, it's usually not worth it. Yeah.
So why did you do it?
Well, so that's the right to take.
Okay.
The next step would be the appeal of value, and the idea. So that's a pretty common argument that happens.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I was surprised in terms of talking to my attorneys, like in the process, like as we're going to trial. It's like, how many have you done? Like they're like, oh, we've done 1,000 cases. Like, how many go to trial? He's like, I don't know, like 11.
Wow.
Yeah, I was like, yeah, these things always settle.
Yeah.
And it's really rare the amount of.
So what spurred that? I mean, who was it decided? Was there some politician that said, you know what, we're gonna take this land at this amount, or not? Or we're gonna take the land?
Yeah, I think it was
Public pressure.
Public pressure on politicians. I think that I think there's a fair argument to be made to like that the city should buy it.
I do too.
I think that so I had really no problem with them taking it.
Yeah.
The idea is it's more about a value case. I think if you want to know the exact history, our current council member Cheeto Vela was on planning commission and was the one that made the motion. Now the public inference that was out there was that I had a demo permit and I was going to use it like a gun against their head. And which is just nonsense. I mean, we had been.
You could have used it.
I absolutely could have.
And you didn't.
And we did not. So
Right.
I had no intent. And this is like what we've said ad infinitum throughout this entire process.
Yeah.
That was not our intent. The only benefit to having that demo permit was that it gave the city staff a little bit of cover in order to be the actual applicant on the process.
Right.
Like that was beneficial in the sense that, I didn't have to pay these huge permit fees, but the idea is like, there's no public cost.
Yeah.
The idea is like it's city staff doing city staff things.
Yeah.
And the idea is like we're trying to cooperate as a landowner to try
Yeah.
and find, facilitate taking something that's been vacant for 40 years and trying to find a way to, repurpose it.
So what are they doing with that?
So they took this property in 2019. What's even worse is they told everyone, us as taxpayers,
Yeah.
that this was going to cost $267,000
Yeah.
when they went through and approved the right to use eminent domain to take it.
Yeah.
And then said, it may cost a few $100,000 for this,
Yeah.
this, that, and the other. Well, the reality is there's been internal documents with the city that it's going to cost millions.
Yeah.
And then millions to operate.
Yeah.
And then millions to plan.
Yeah.
And it's still there.
Wow. That is a shining example of government misuse.
Yeah. I think we're creeping up on 5 years since they took it.
Wow. Oh my God.
Yeah, because I've got a 7-year-old.
Yeah.
And I think he was 2 when we were at some of these meetings.
That is a fascinating story.
Yeah. Fun fact is in 5 years, if they don't make any forward progress, I think state law gives me the right to attempt to buy it back. But so if city council's listening, please complete the building.
Yeah, really. Yeah. Okay. Well, look, this has been really fascinating. Thank you for coming on. Any other tips or any other, like, I don't know, after everything you've been through, like, what do you think you already said one thing was parking downtown, right? But like for people that are listening.
Not just downtown. I think parking, currently I think all development requires 2 parking spaces per unit.
Yeah.
I think we could just change that to 1.
Yeah.
And that becomes a simple process.
Yeah.
I think the next thing would be the more political thing would be to eliminate subchapter F.
Yeah.
Because that is an incredibly complicated process that I think slows staff down and slows the process down.
Yeah.
I think we could streamline inspections. There's a lot of things that, I think we need a culture shift in the ideas that like inspectors, I think need to figure out a way to like work with developers. It oftentimes seems very adversarial.
Yeah.
And like, I think we need to change that culture in some capacity to try and like help facilitate that. The ideas, what can we do to help? And
So have you ever thought of going into politics?
After this process, no.
Yeah, right.
No. I think the challenge is, and I'm surprised Kirk Watson ran again. I think it would be really challenging currently to operate in the city government process that we have. We just let Spencer Cronk go.
Yeah.
Right. And so the city manager runs essentially everything.
That was because of Treezilla,
right?
Or whatever
you can say that. I think really what ticked a lot of people off was the particularly Cheeto Vela was the one that voted to initiate the process to fire him. I think there was significant frustration historically with him, but I think that the real thing that really I think triggered a lot of people was the fact that there was an initial 1-year contract that was being negotiated with APD, and then I think Cronk came in with a 4-year contract that he had side negotiated.
Yeah.
And that was not the intent of council, and so that was I think the straw that broke the camel's back.
Okay, that makes a little more sense.
But
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Austin, thank you so much for
Yeah,
being
glad
on
to do it.
our broadcast.
Yeah. Cool. Good to see you.
You too. Wow.